Good evening, everyone. Last Saturday evening, Senior Ghana Elder Uncle Lewis O'Brien and his granddaughter Gypsy Wheatra welcomed David Carline and Cheryl Buchanan to Ghana land. Welcome, friends, to this event, which is part of the National Quaker Gathering being held here in Adelaide this year. My name is Jo Jordan, and I'm the presiding clerk of Australia Yearly Meeting. This presentation is being internet broadcast, so we welcome friends from throughout Australia and overseas to join us for this annual James Backhouse lecture. James Backhouse, with his companion, George Washington Walker, visited Australia from England between 1832 and 1838. They travelled widely, but spent most of their time in Tasmania. They made careful reports to government officials on penal reform, the rum trade, and the treatment of Aborigines. As a result, Quaker Meetings began in Australia. This series of lectures is intended to bring fresh insights into the truth. This year's lecture is timely in its focus on the 1967 referendum, passed by a majority of over 90% of votes to include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the census and to enable the Commonwealth to make laws for their benefit. Tonight's presentation looks at what has happened in the subsequent 50 years from an Aboriginal perspective. David Carline is a member of Queensland Regional Meeting and of the Society of Friends, and from the Kuma-Guamu Nation near Kalamala in central southern Queensland. David works closely with his community to support young people through their education and has been especially engaged in the development of Murra Murra Station, which is an Aboriginal-owned. He's a member of our First Nations Peoples Committee and has actively participated in a series of workshops involving Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people at our Quaker Centre near Canberra. Cheryl Buchanan, David's niece, also from the Kuma-Guamu Nation, has had a varied career. From involvement with the Brisbane Tribal Council, the Australian Union of Students and Black Resources Centre. She is a writer on history, politics, education, land rights and prison welfare. She has helped establish the Murray Cooey Aboriginal publishing firm. As is our custom, we will begin with silence, and David and Cheryl will speak when they are ready. At the end of the presentation, we will return to silence before concluding with the shaking of hands. There is no publication of the lecture at this stage, but we hope to publish in some form what our speakers say tonight. You are invited to join us with refreshments after the lecture.
Good evening, friends. Is that mic all right? Right, I'll speak up a bit louder then. At the back there, you can get the sign there. Friends, first of all, I would like to acknowledge the Kaurna people the traditional owners of this land, and the welcome that they've put out to both my niece and myself, and to yearly meeting, to hold our yearly meeting here on their lands. In preparing for this talk, a few things came to light that I wasn't aware of. One, that James Backhouse came to Queensland, and the Turrbal people have oral history of that meeting. They still talk about yarning with that Quaker fella. So tonight it's a continuation of that Quaker involvement with Aboriginals. The focus, yes, the referendum, which was 50 years ago, May the 27th, in fact, it was 50 years. Quite a lot has been published about what happened then. Many of you would have been alive then, as I myself was. And we'll be talking a little bit about how government policies and practices of the past, how they're impacted on our lives, how we've struggled to retain our identity. Anyway, first of all, I'll identify myself. I'm David Carline. I'm of the Guamu people in what is now southwest Queensland, about 900 kilometres west of Brisbane. It's a reasonably big property area that we, the Guamu people, are involved in. My story starts with my mother was the Aboriginal woman. She was one of the stolen generation. We always knew we were Aboriginal. She was quite dark, in fact, so there was no really hiding that. She was taken from Charleville or Bendina, we're unsure where the protector had taken her from, and was brought up with the nuns. After that, she was then put out to work on properties herself for many years, and then eventually left that and went into Brisbane, where she stayed for some time. So my mother was Aboriginal, my father was a white man. He was actually an American in the war, and I was born during the war. Very hard times, particularly for Aboriginal women with children. In those days, the policy was to take the children. So she put up a very strong fight to retain her children. And it was a difficult time when I look back on it, but at the time, it was life. And it was full of love as well. I was brought up in a place that's called Camp Muckley. It was an army camp. There was some army huts, but it had army huts that had yumbas, tents. Some had electricity. There was ablution blocks and a water tap that we all got our waters from. So that's where I was there until I was about 9. And then we moved into more army huts, but this time a little bit more upmarket, with electricity, running water, and toilets. So we're slowly getting a better lifestyle. This went on until I was about 13, and when we eventually moved into a house. I was 13 when I first lived in a house and had my own room. It was very uncomfortable. I'd never had a room to myself, and I always remember feeling most unhappy about it. But leading up to this, I had actually, I don't know whether people know Brisbane, but the valley in Brisbane is pretty central Brisbane. We were living in Gregory Terrace. And I started to get involved, or a friend from school, a young English boy who was immigrant in them days, or New Australians, and this young lad and I were getting on quite well. And it turned out he was a Jehovah's Witness. So at the age of 12, I started to be involved with Jehovah's Witnesses. And this went on for quite a few years, about 5 or 6 years. Just through preparing for this lecture, I've realised that for 50 years I was ashamed of talking about that. I don't know why, and this is probably the first time I've publicly spoken about that influence on my life. With the movements that my family had, as I said, we ended up in a house. I eventually joined the Jehovah's Witnesses and moved to Sydney. And I was down there for a few years and being involved with the witnesses. But then after a while, a couple of years, by the time I was 18, I was starting to realise I wasn't comfortable with it. There were a lot of beliefs that I didn't quite agree with. Others I did, pacifism being one of them, of course. But I will say this for them, their sincerity I'll never fault. But I mention that because the influence, it turns out, went through my life. After I left them, at about 18, I decided that I would go off and see the world. And in them days, when the migrants came out, they came in boats, so the boats went back empty. And it was very cheap for us to go to England. So part of the going there was I went to New Zealand and then earn a few more dollars or pounds and then go through to England. I went to New Zealand and ended up working in a hospital for handicapped kids, mentally handicapped kids. And I was a student nurse in fact and started getting involved with that. But I was always going to go to England, so I pulled out after 2 years and went to England. While in Europe, I did a lot of travel around Europe and eventually ended up in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa. And I was working with a charity called the Leonard Cheshire Homes, waiting for a Peace Corps worker to come through. So I had 3 months there in Addis. My time there really made me realise how well off we were. Part of my job was helping a nun, and in them days the lepers had to live with the dead. So we'd take bags of food or flour and stuff down to the cemetery to the lepers. And it always stuck in my mind and made me appreciate my life and what we had. Yes, it was very heart-wrenching and still sticks with me to this day. I eventually got home to Australia in 66, just before the referendum. In them days I wasn't particularly political, but I certainly was an advocate for the referendum. The results you've all heard, 90% or over 90% voted in favour of Aboriginal, the yes vote. The other 10%, the variations were quite markedly different. In the cities, very small no vote, very high yes vote. In country areas, quite a high no vote. So there are different attitudes, but at least they did get through in the end, the referendum. So that was quite a marking turning point in our lives, how things had changed for us. And they did start slowly changing. At this point in 67, I decided I'd go back and finish the nursing in New Zealand. So I went back over there with good intent to work with the kids and do that sort of nursing. But once again I got a little bit uneasy about things, and found that I was able to get into the Maritime Union. So I joined the Seamen, or Cooks and Stewards Union as it was in them days. So I spent 20 years at sea. I mention this because I spent a lot of my time in the South Pacific. And to this day, I still have a great love for the South Pacific. And that ties in later on with stuff I was going to mention about. After many years in New Zealand, my partner committed suicide. And so I realised I wasn't in the right place. I need to come back home. So I returned home to Australia in the early 80s. And it was around that time that, well, it was around then that I started to come to Quaker Meetings. I'd first heard about the Quakers through Joan Baez, of all people, back in the 60s. And the things that she had said, I thought, I'll have to investigate them people one day. And then when I was in New Zealand, Waiheke Island, there was a small meeting there. They had advertised, so I'd gone along to a meeting. And of course, it was very strange to me, the silence. But I knew these people had something. I felt quite at home there. I didn't have the Jesus stuff crammed down my neck anymore. This was a spiritual experience to me. So when I came home to Brisbane, I decided to start going to meetings. And that I did. Not as regularly as I could have done. At that time also, the AIDS epidemic had just come out, so there was a lot of hype against gay people in particular. I felt quite upset about this, and along with another friend, another Quaker, we set up a house to do emergency care for AIDS people. And we had a few people come through. This was before they started to have any care taken for them at all. The various organisations arose after that. This was just the very, very early parts of the AIDS epidemic. During all this time, my own unhappiness, the loss of my partner, the loss, so I left a good job, resettling in, I found I was drinking the alcohol excessively. And I knew that I had to do something. So I went and I was detoxed. And during that detoxing, involvement with AA. And the third step talks about handing your life over, which I did. And it just seemed right, the God of my understanding, the Great Spirit. And from that time onwards, my life seemed to have changed. I talk about receiving gifts from the Great Spirit. Not financial things, just my whole life changed. I found I got a good job, working at the university with Indigenous education. The time came when the contract ran out, and by this time I thought, no, I want to do more than just work here. And about the same time, the nuclear protests at Mararoa were taking place, or the testing was taking place at Mararoa. And I was invited to be part of a group of Indigenous people to go to Tahiti to show our solidarity with them. Greenpeace were very good to us, and they actually allowed me to sail out on one of their vessels to Mararoa for the second testing. So when you do actions and you get involved in actions. When it's over, there's this void of what do you do next? Where's your life leading you? I had this strong, overpowering urge, and I believe it was a leading, to go and get to know your people on country, not the urban blackfella, but to go back to the land of the Cooma people. It was a great challenge to return back to my people and to get to meet relatives that I didn't really know I had. With my earlier, I just skipped back a bit there, my mother's mother, we did meet up when I was about 10 or 12, but it was not successful. When these stolen children meet up with their blood parents, not all of them were that successful, and unfortunately my family was one of them. And I still have contact with my cousins, but that bonding never happened. By the time I realised that cousins were blood, before I'd always had aunties within the Aboriginal community. But when I had a blood auntie, it just was no different. But anyway, getting back to Colomulla, I returned home and got involved with the politics at the time of the Cooma people in the early days. There were different things happened. Friends were very much supportive of me. In them days it was called the Cooma Corporation for Land, which I was heavily involved in. And eventually we had different programs going, an outstation movement, other involvements within Colomulla itself. Eventually we were returned land in the form of two properties, Marramara and Bendy Downs, which we still have today. We had them for 12 years, Cheryl?
17 this year.
70. They had it for quite a while. My niece was chairperson there for many years, and under her direction we were able to put about a third of the property under conservation, but she will talk about that further on. So over this last period I've been involved with the Marramara and Bendy Downs, the various programs we had there, ENU Fest, the Young People's Festival. There was quite a lot of programs we conducted out there. In the meantime, I'd realised that work for me, I wouldn't take work from a younger Aboriginal person. So most of my work had been voluntary. I continued to do voluntary until I retired. I'm still involved, by the way. And so I realised that there was a great need for foster carers. So I took up fostering. I had a young lad who came to me when he was 13. He's still in my life, he's 23 now. And his brother wasn't with me as much as my main son there, Reese. And it's been, it's been a lesson, but there are real joys to see a young lad. I don't know what so I made my own noose, and I said to him, "You've been to too many pillars and posts, you ought to stop." Didn't really mean with me, but as I said, this boy had been hurt badly. We get one rejection and weeping and wailing. 143 in year 13. So, young Reese brought me sadness and joys. Yes, there were court cases with him, but he has come good. He has come good. So I'm pleased for doing that part as well. Oh, thank you. Excuse me. As I've got older, my health hasn't been as good as it was a few years ago. So once again, I'm adapting to what my capabilities are. Now at the moment, I find that I can operate a small nursery, greenhouse, and my plans are to start growing grasses and trees that we can revegetate Murra and Bendy Downs. So that's part of my present projects at the moment. Along the way, skipping back a bit, in my returning to Cunnamulla, I discovered, yes, I did have more family. Somehow or other, I had a blind side of my grandmother was alone. No, she wasn't. She was like most of us. She had siblings. She had a couple of sisters, which we're just finding out about. This is what happened when they took us apart. We lost contact with our own people. Cheryl is my niece through my grandmother's sister, through her line. And I'm very pleased to have found such a relative. Her energy, principles are very strong, but I will let her talk about that a bit more. I might leave it at that for now, friends. Cheryl, would you like to?
Well, Yama. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Ghana people whose land we're meeting on tonight. And I'm sorry that we weren't here for the welcome. It's nice to know that Uncle Dave was happy when he found out that I was his relative. I'm one of the few people in Australia who'd want that, I'd say. So my journey begins in Cunnamulla, and thank you, friends, for allowing me to, have an opportunity to share my life with you tonight. I'm not a Quaker, I'm not religious at all, but I'm a very spiritual person, and I think that's the kind of plane on which Papa and I have this amazing relationship that we've developed over the years. In Cunnamulla in those days, I was born in 1953, and it was a very different place. I was very lucky though, very fortunate. I had a great grandmother and a mother who was one of 7 sisters. And I only knew love. I was one of the very fortunate people who only knew love as a child. So I was embraced by these amazing, beautiful black women, and like all great women, loved to tell stories. So our favourite pastime was fighting over who was going to get in the bath, this huge bathtub with Grandma, because we had boil water and we'd fill it up and, be right up. And the bathroom was the favourite place to be. So we spent hours and hours in there. One would hop out and we'd put some more water in, and then someone else would go. And so the whole family kind of life evolved all more or less around this bathroom. When we weren't doing that, we were eating, of course. So I had a great-grandmother who lived in the Yamba, which was over the sandhills, a bit like the dunes we're here. We used to have to walk over the sandhills to go down to the Yamba, where people lived in fourth world conditions. And so I was exposed to both of those things. But I had this interesting life as well, in that because my mother and aunts were these beautiful women, we had all of these people, men mostly, constantly coming to the household. And so we never starved. I said to Pop Dave, we always had meat. We were very lucky. We always had roo or whatever it was, sheep, something to eat. But then when I look back on my life, as we were, talking about this lecture, I realised as well that, within our household, so the only gay man who actually said he was gay in Cunnamulla always came to our house. We had the only man who was hermaphrodite always came to our house. We had a lot of people with mental health issues who only ever came to our house. We had Chinese people. We had people of a lot of different nationalities. There were people they called gypsies who used to come to our house. So I was exposed to this different world that a lot of other people refer to when they talk about their childhood. And I mention it because whenever I get down in my life, that is the place in my memory that I always go back to. That's the place that gives me strength, that gives me drive, that gives me the passion to understand that there's huge differences amongst people in this world, but that there are good people as well. And so it is a wonderful place for me to refer back to. People always ask me, you seem to be involved for a long time. When did you first get involved? And my first memory was when I was about 9, so probably a bit older than some of you are here. I had a huge argument with my uncle, because he was involved in the kangaroos, skinning. We used to skin kangaroos and sell them, and used to salt them and do all kinds of things. And I was appalled by this, absolutely appalled. And so I had this huge argument. This was the man who was later to become known as the Bilby brother, one of the Bilby brothers, Frank Mantley, who married one of Mum's sisters, Auntie Eva, and who became very committed and dedicated to saving the Bilby. But that was when I had my first, I would say, political argument, where I actually could articulate something and understood why I was talking about it. And then, because education was something that I was told was very important to do. My grandmother was big on education, and she always said the only way you're going to survive in this world is to get an education, because you're going to have to walk in the both worlds. My grandmother spoke language fluently. In the early days of our childhood, she spoke, we heard language spoken fluently. And then as I got older, it completely disappeared until there were no more fluent language speakers left of the Guamu language. Which is very depressing, I suppose. There's so many facets of life that I can look back on. But I think the turning point as well for me was really I'd come down to Everton Park High School in 1966. And I used to wag school and go to the trades hall. And that's where I learned about the fact that the referendum was going to happen. And so, my life in 67 was helping to hand out leaflets, and prior to that in late 66. And, you know, I met a great Grumple man, Bob Anderson, who was a very strong trade unionist, and I became very exposed then as a very young person to the trade union movement. And trade union organisers in those days, as were the organisers within the Communist Party and many other people who supported us, there were very important processes to follow. One was about you never went out on the streets, you never did anything unless you had your communication down pat. So the words on the paper of the leaflet that you were going to hand out had to be checked, double checked, they had to be absolutely correct. You had to then go and speak to everybody that you could. You exposed yourself to people who supported you, people who, you know, hated your guts, but that's what you had to do. That was a checklist almost. And so in doing that, I think, again, you become exposed to a whole regime of ideas, which some are just so far right, you couldn't even imagine how right-wing some people were, to some that were so far left. And of course, I identified more and more with the further left you could go, the better for me. In doing that, you know, another question that people often ask is, how much we were influenced by what was happening in America, what was happening, you know, with American Indians and everyone else overseas. And I had to think about this before this lecture, because we actually were responding not to anything that was happening anywhere else, but the things that were happening within our community. And so I had ended up in Brisbane, and I went to university, started going to university there in the early 70s. And getting to know the Brisbane community, and then 2 hours away from Brisbane was the Cherbourg Aboriginal Reserve, it was called then. And to look at the way that people lived, and to begin to understand the fact that there was this legislation in place that was put in place in 1897, and it was called the Restriction of Opium and Protection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Act, 1897. And the reason for it was that they believed that the Chinese were giving opium to Aboriginal people. This is rubbish, that's called, of course. And so, you know, the Chinese Opium Act was put in with the Aboriginal Act. So it was like, let's kill two birds with one stone. And the thing about it was that here we were in the 70s, early 70s, and getting to understand completely that people's lives were totally dictated to. You know, yeah, we had some bad times and a lot of racism in Cunnamulla. But to know that these laws were such that people had to get permission to leave a reserve. They had to get permission to go back onto reserve. There were bylaws in place where you could get fined for riding a horse and not shutting a gate. You can look up all of these things, it's all true. It's not making any of it up. And you had a man called Patrick Colloran, who I know as soon as I say that name, Uncle Dave will shudder. He was the director of Native Affairs, and he'd had a history in Native Affairs. And a man of very devious kind of nature. I found him to be quite a devious man, and not a man of principle at all. And what they did was ensure that they completely and utterly had absolute control of the 26 Aboriginal reserves and missions that were operating in Queensland. So there were 19 Aboriginal reserves, gazetted Aboriginal reserves, and then the others were missions. So you've heard of, you know, Lutheran mission, like for example at Hopevale and so on. And these were very big tracts of land, the reserves, that were set aside. There were huge tracts of land, and in 1976, I remember, having a child, and I was married to a man from Cherbourg, and we couldn't get permission to go up and see his mother. We used to have to sneak into Cherbourg. That's what we used to have to do. And I remember we wanted to go to Warrabinda once to inform people about what was going on with the Queensland Act, because we were running a campaign to try and get rid of it. We were given 5 or 10 minutes to get out of town. And so this is how we were treated. We were seen as, black power, radicals, black nationalists, you name it, all of the words were put, to the kind of activity that we're involved in. But that Queensland Act campaign and, trying to get rid of that act was one of the biggest campaigns that happened after that 67 referendum. And Uncle Dave, Pop mentioned about change. Well, there was no change that came after 67 referendum for Aboriginal people whatsoever. This big, icing on the cake that we thought was going to happen never happened. We still had the damper, to live with. And we began to, I was one of the founders of the Aboriginal Legal Service and the Aboriginal Medical Service in the early 70s as well. And we started to set up our own services, and we sought volunteers from the university, so people who were involved in doing medical, or legal studies, and they used to come and do voluntary work, and that's how those services began. So all of that work, right through that period of time, the 70s and 80s, all voluntary. So the Aboriginal people, all the white people, it was all voluntary. And if people got any kind of wage, it would have been considered as, way below whatever the minimum rate should have been, including for the lawyers. But, we had, people like Terry O'Gorman, who became a great human rights lawyer. Wayne Goss, as you know, who became Premier, was one of the early lawyers within the Aboriginal Legal Service. And the cry for us, I think, and the main thing that we talked about was self-determination. And really what self-determination means is just that when you get up in the morning, you have a right to decide what you want to do with your life and how you want to live it, and that you will have the means to be able to do that. You will have adequate housing, you'll have adequate health services or facilities or whatever it is to, enable you to do that. But the statistics, of course, spoke a different story, as you all know, or some of you may or may not know, that we were looking at the highest infant mortality rate in the world through that period. We were looking at incarceration rates, which I hate to say are on the rise again for Aboriginal men, worse for Aboriginal women, and the number of Aboriginal juveniles who are coming through now, it should be an international crisis. And even with all of those statistics and with all of that understanding, you would think that there would want to be, opportunities for the government to take on board what they said they would do. The federal people would step in and they'd save the day, and they'd hammer the states, and you have to go and do this and do it. Of course, they did nothing at all. And so the other thing that happened was that we began to realise very quickly that if we didn't begin talking about and making a big noise about land, then we would be forgotten completely as a people. It was really a sense of, I think it was Paul Hazlitt who said, about the dying pillow. I remember some quote somewhere in my life about that. And was it right? Was it Paul Hazlitt?
Daisy Bates.
Daisy Bates. It was a Daisy Bates. But I think Paul Hazlitt made a similar kind of statement as well. And that really horrified me, because it was, and I'd get up and I remember saying that if we don't do something, people are only going to be reading about us in books. And that was my motivational kind of speech, I remember at the time. Going, we've really got to get up and we've really got to fight. And so my involvement with land rights was at very early days. I was a great fundraiser, and again, rubbed off from all the union people I used to listen to, and when I wagged school or hang around, do whatever. And so I raised funds for the first land rights conference to be held in Darwin in 1973. And so that was the first conference nationally, and it was really well attended. And from there, I then raised funds for the first meeting to take place in Cairns in 1974-75 to set up the what's now known as the North Queensland Land Council. Land rights has one of those things that keeps morphing. It goes from the idea of people having access to country by access. When you have access to land, it's like you have access to something that you own. So you can freely go there, and you can go to the river, and you can fish and swim and go and visit your cultural sites. That's what we mean by access. Land ownership, what we mean when we talk about land ownership, is inalienable freehold title. I think there's anywhere in Australia that has that? Probably not. Or there'd be 1%, 2% of any Aboriginal lands that are held. Most lands are held in trust. So all of these dreams and hopes that came through the Northern Territory Land Rights Bill, the South Australian Land Rights Bill, everyone who's ever talked about land rights at a government level, have all really fallen on deaf ears, in the sense that in 2017, I don't think we're as much closer that we were in those days to land rights. Then, of course, you had native title, and I don't know. I was grappling with whether or not I should talk about native title, but it's something that probably a lot of you might have heard about, but don't really have any kind of understanding of it. And the Native Title Act, of course, was all about one thing: to try and think of another way to hold off blackfellas fighting for land. That's what it really was about. And so, what a great tool! I mean, I always said that John Howard had the most amazing spin doctors of any Prime Minister that I know. Amazing spin doctors. And, to come up with this kind of bill, this Native Title Act, has meant that in some cases it's put father against son, mother against daughter, families don't talk to each other, and so on. But I want to talk about the experience as I've seen it from our Guamu nation, from Topanai, in that it took us 22 years from when we first put in a claim to our country. And as you know, mostly all of the country is extinguished because they're pastoral stations or pastoral properties in many of the areas. But what happens when you have a connection report? You have to prove individually that you have a connection to that country. So you have to, we thought it was just oral history. You would think that, wouldn't you? You would think, the anthropologists, and they can come and talk to us, and we can share our stories, and everything's going to be fine. No, it's not that at all. It is, we're quite happy to listen to your stories, and you can tell your little cultural business and show us things here and there. At the end of the day, we go on the documents. So the government documents, right, that you find within the departments, that are held by some museums, that's what gives the real verification to your story. Now, if you can't find that, and you'll hear people talk about that, you will not get anywhere near native title, because you can't prove your connection. We were very lucky that there were some documents from the Police Protectorate in Bowen about Bendina, which is our clan country. And so there's mention of our families on that. But the other thing that I saw was that the longer it went on, this process, and like I said, 22 years all up, it meant that people did have to think right back in their memory and start thinking about things that their granny had shared with them or their grandfather had shared with them. Try and remember the importance of those stories, what they really meant. And in doing so, there began a lot of discussion within families and a lot of sharing of these stories that people had never ever heard before. And so that is a positive that I saw from it. And what I saw as well, especially from the older people who were involved, like my mum and others, was that it was a very sad experience at the beginning for them. But then the further along that they got in the process, I saw this cultural revitalisation occurring as well. This greater rising of culture and strength and identity, and people really beginning to go, hey, this is our country. So instead of being a fringe dweller in Cunnamulla, or feeling like a dispossessed person, or feeling like a colonised person, or whatever it was, people began to use language names for places, for ceremonies, and so on, began to sing songs again. And so I'm probably the only person, one of the few people in Australia who'll even say there's anything positive about native title. But I think that I want to see something positive out of it, because I don't want to think that all of our elders passed away for nothing, because we lost so many elders during that process. Now, the other thing that I saw, which I haven't spoken publicly about, that I think is really interesting about native title, is that once you get consent determination, even though you know, okay, it's all been extinguished and you only have access to, these little bits of the country or whatever, what it actually does is that you, for the first time, and the lawyers kept saying to this, once you get consent determination, you can say this, and no one in the world can challenge it. You can say, we know for a fact, according to Western law, that this part of this country that we call the Quaker Nation was always ours from time immemorial. Now, how powerful is that? That was never said before that. Those kind of, the way that people looked at country and looked at things was never explained in those kind of terms. Now, once you've got people thinking as a nation, and they say we had 500 tribes, we call them nations, If you look at it in that way, as a clan-based people, and with native title, you have apical ancestors that you refer back to, right? And so a lot of the way that the prescribed body corporates are set up after native title, you have to have a prescribed body corporate to hold your native title rights and interests. The way that they're established is that all of those apical ancestors must be represented as the decision makers. So you get this process which, sure, Howard didn't even know this was going to happen. But what it has meant is that every clan group, thousands of years, it's the same kind of process in the way that we did our business for thousands and thousands of years. So it's almost like this full circle. And the other opportunity that comes with that kind of new governance structure is this, that it allows you to then look at all kinds of possibilities into the future. And those possibilities can be in terms of funding, for example. So you've got a town like Cunnamulla, and I'll use Cunnamulla as an example. Cunnamulla have 6 different tribal groups who are all shoved in there when they got pushed off stations because the station owners no longer wanted to pay the award wages. You know, remember in the, what was it, the 40s or something? You know, post-war anyway. Everyone ended up as fringe dwellers. And that was kind of all around Australia that was happening. And, you know, so you have opportunities with funding so that, for example, if you have a health service, you could have a representative from each of those tribes on the health service becoming decision makers. So it stops what happens all the time within Aboriginal organisations, largely, is vote stacking. You know about vote stacking? Mm-hmm. Anyone who's been on the CWA or... you know the importance of vote stacking. Yes, and I make the best page. You know, I can do this for you and I can do that. It stops all of that because it allows people to actually have a real say within their future. Now, this is only all talk, because these are the talks that I want to have, you know, into the future with government as well. So I thought I would share that with you and just throw it out there and see what you think of that idea. You know, I can talk for 4 or 5 hours, 6 hours. It's absolutely no problem to me whatsoever. But I'll just go back and share a few things in my life that I'm really proud of doing. And one of those was setting up the first black community school and the first Aboriginal women's legal and advocacy service in 1994 in Brisbane, which was a huge thing. And I want to mention that because the way that things have presented themselves now within our community is that we're dealing with this lateral violence. And so it's a new kind of, you know, I don't know where it's come from or how it's happened. But there's always that thing of, you know, when people are colonised and they kind of internalise everything, and that's why we get depressed and we do all kinds of things to ourselves and we hurt each other. But what is happening now, a lot within our community, is that with a lot of egos in play, there's a lot of bullying that's gone on within organisations. And we need to start talking about it because it is affecting our ability to get the job done, to really do the hard yards that we should be doing. It really affects it. So if someone's bullying to an extent, it means that people will sit in a meeting and say nothing, do nothing, and if you multiply that by 500 nations, you've got a whole problem happening. And so that's another thing that I'm throwing out there that I'll be spending a lot of time talking about into my future, because I think it's an important thing and no one's got a handle on it. I don't have the answer to any of these things myself, but I think that we'd be very foolish not to take heed and not to try to do something about it. The other thing is youth and youth suicide, and I feel a bit strange because I'm very aware of these young people here. But just within Brisbane alone, in the Brisbane community, and I'll use that as an example, you know, you could probably go to a funeral almost every week, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. This is happening on the communities as well. And so it's not just young people. There were a lot of young people who are doing it. It's now progressed, so it's a lot of middle-aged people as well who are doing it. It was just men. It's now young women who are doing it. And if you read things like the Don Dale, you know, report, you should get a hold of that, because you know, when you get exposed at an early age to that kind of violence and that kind of intrusion into your life, and, you know, this is probably not even a year, so these will be all, she only passed away, we buried her last Friday. Pop's just brought all of these people. Uncle Bob passed away, that was last month. And this is what we do. We collect these. My son has got so many of these, of all his friends and cousins, most of them are cousins, or people that he grew up with. And, you know, this is it. This is all their stories. This is all the people that we have lost, you know. And that's probably only in the last couple of years. And that's ditto for every other Aboriginal community that you go to. Everyone's talking about the same kind of thing. And so I know that there are some positives that I've shared with you, but I also don't want to pretend that in the last 50 years there have been these huge changes. And the most recent thing, the statement from the heart, is people are referring back to, you know, what is it that we need in this country? Because for whatever reason, and, you know, I was sharing this with your husband, you know, today. It doesn't matter what nationality you are. If you are Aboriginal, we are still the most despised people. We're still at the bottom end of the pecking order in this country. Why is it? And I ask myself this every day. Why is it they say that we're 3 or 4% of the population in Australia? What is the fear? What is the fear in this country about Aboriginal people? What is it that has not allowed in 230 years for someone to have a heart, to get, you know, some generosity of spirit, and said it is time to absolutely stop everything that's happened before and to take, you know, charge of something and to be able to allow our people to live as human beings. Now, I'm 64, right? People still say to me, well, what would you be? Would you be a half caste or would you be a quarter caste? I've had that said to me this year. Now, we're the only race in Australia. If someone goes up and says, oh, I'm Greek, well, which part of Greece are you from? Oh, I'm Italian. Oh, you're from the north or the south. You know, whatever nationality, Yugoslavia, wherever you are, you can be from wherever you want to be. But as soon as you say that you are Aboriginal, you know, if you're not full blood, they'll go, oh, well, you half caste or quarter caste, quadroon, and well, I mean, in the 70s and 60s they were going octagon, I was going, Jesus, I was pretty good at maths, but you know, I mean, it was just like downright crazy. And so, it's a simple thing to ask you, but why is that happens in this country? And there's no one here's going to challenge me on it because you know yourself that that's what still happens. You know, it still happens. And so, I say all the time, we will never move forward in this country. No matter what happens, there is this obsession with, and when I talk about white fellas, I'm talking about white fellas in power. Those who identify strongly with the multinational corporations and the power positions, right? You know, they have no regard whatsoever, even for their own children or their grandchildren. I've been at Mineral Council meetings and National Irrigator Council meetings and a lot of other meetings, and I go, you know, that's great, you do all the mining and you do all that. So what happens after you take every last bit of mineral resource from this country You know, what are you leaving for your children? What is the legacy that you're leaving for your children? And you know what? They don't care. You know, because if they did care, we would not have the decisions that are being made now. That changed the Native Title Act to allow Adani to go ahead. How can that happen? You know, how can that happen? So we changed this law about Indigenous land use agreements so that Adani can happen in this country. And we know the reef's dead. You know, we've got scientists, you know, who earlier this year, the same scientist who went down in that big capsule with David Attenborough, stood up at a meeting and said, the reef is dead. It's not dying, it's dead, it's irreparable. And I think to myself, well, you know, people probably don't associate with that with Aboriginal people, but that is part of some nation's heritage, you know, some important story, dreaming place or whatever. And it's like the cultural, you know, this beautiful artwork that they had in Western Australia. Said, oh, well, we'll come along with our cranes, we'll pick the rocks up, it doesn't matter where we put them, oh, let's throw them over, put them over here, put them upside down, and, you know, artworks hundreds of thousands of years old, and people got sick in the community. You know, I remember first learning about the Green Ant Dreaming story, you know, when they were talking about the Ranger mine, you know, where they said, once you start digging it up, it will mean destruction. But you see, these people in power, they think that they can control nature. No one can control nature. But one thing that Aboriginal people have is a relationship with nature. We still have a very, very strong relationship with nature. And I say that because some of you saw a film called Healing the River. We're actually part of that ceremony that took place from the beginning of you know, our country, and we danced. We did ceremony all the way down to the mouth of the Murray. You know, in the big drought, we made the rain come. We actually made the rain come. Not that anyone will ever say that. You know, the bombs, the Bureau of Meteorology, I'm sure they wouldn't acknowledge that. But Aboriginal people still have incredible power in terms of the relationship that we have with land, with water, with sea, with air within this country. And the future really is to work out a way to begin a more important dialogue about how we're going to move forward. And I refer back to the Truth and Conciliation Commission because I think that that's really something similar to what we need in this country. You know, like, let's face it, I didn't go into the big story tonight, but, you know, we have 8, well, it's actually 7 Aboriginal ancestors. Now, how do you get 7 people? Well, because there's a massacre, and it was only those people who survived. That's how you get 7 Aboriginal ancestors in a native title claim. Because our great grannies survived a massacre. That's the stories I grew up with. And, you know, people have to acknowledge in this country the dark history. You know, Lyndall Ryan is now doing this map about, you know, a lot of the massacres on the East Coast. And that will be very revealing. Does it mean that these young people will be taught in school about it? Of course it doesn't. Because we still don't have compulsory education when it comes to Aboriginal history within curriculum. It's all spasmodic. It's all, if there's a good principle, oh, you'll have the greatest NAIDOC day and you'll have all these Aboriginal activities happening all the time. But if you have a school of someone who is, you know, completely redneck, so they don't want to hear about Aboriginal people, and you won't have anything taught in that particular school. And that's how mishmash this whole thing is, you know. But, you know, I believe it's really important for us as people to keep reminding others that this is only one planet. You know, do you all realise that? Do you actually realise that, you young people? This is only one planet. We all, every person on this earth that we call human being, we're in this one planet. So you know, you've seen the series, The Dome, you would have recognised that. We're in the Dome. That's who we are as a people. And the sooner we can learn to live with each other, you know, the better it is. One of the greatest things that happened in my life was Pop Dave, meeting Pop Dave. Now, my mum and aunt are tough people, and he didn't tell their story. They're tough women to get past. Who are you? Where are you from? Yeah. Who do you belong to? Whatever. Yeah, okay. We'll think about that. But Pop told a story about how he jumped on a bus, and the bus broke down in Bolin, which is on our traditional country. And when he got out, he said, looked out, and all these emus started walking towards him. That's all he had to say. That's the only part of the story I need to know. I knew straight away that he was one of ours. I knew straight away that he was my blood. I didn't need to hear anything more. That was it. And yes, he might have had a sad thing in his family. Doesn't matter, because my entire family has embraced him, you know, absolutely and lovingly, and he's absolutely everything to my family. And what he doesn't talk about is his cultural knowledge that he has, and culturally he plays a very important role for us, because what he does is that he makes all of our emu feathers that we use for our dance, and the costumes that we wear, if ever you see any of us dancing. And so, yeah, play a very important role. So, you know, for whatever happened in the world, I'm glad the Spirit's brought us together. And on our journey, we've continued to journey together, and we're beginning to find out that not only was there great-great-granny Emma, that Pop Dave's line comes from, and mine comes from great-great-granny Elsie, but that there was another sister, Kate, who we only found out very recently. In February of this year, I met for the first time two aunts, one older than me and one younger than me. Two aunts who I didn't even know I had. And then there's this whole other family that we still haven't even met. Just before I came here, and I haven't even had a chance to talk to Pop, but on my line, on my granddad's side, we finally tracked down his mum. And so I've now found out on my grandfather's line, exactly who we are. So we've got all this family of people that we, you know, don't even know anything about. And it is a heart-rending, distressful, stressful, sad journey sometimes. But at the end of the day, I think to myself, you know, I wouldn't have it any other way, because I think Australia is the most beautiful country in the world. I've travelled the world, I'm like, you know, Pop Dave, I've travelled around. I think this is an amazing country. If you allow this country to talk to you spiritually, it is such a powerful country. It can provide the healing that we all need. It really can. And so, you know, I say this to you as friends, you know, that you all have families, you all have grandchildren, or, you know, children. You're going to have grandchildren and children and great-grannies. you know, you'll be called great granny one day, or grandma, or granddad. Okay, it will happen to you. And just remember that the world is made up of good and not good people. Surround yourself with good people. Surround yourself with positive people. And if you do that in your lives, you can't go wrong. That's what I've done. Mind you, I still have to go and surround myself at meetings with very negative people. But, I'm tough and I can say I do a damn good job of that. And no one will ever take that away from me. But look, thank you so much for allowing me to share these things with you. Like I said, anytime, come back and I can keep talking all day. Pop Dave's telling me I've got to stop. Thank you, and I want to do something which is my way of thanking you, because your presence here is a big a big thank you for me and for Pop. So I'm going to share with you our songline. So I'm Guamu Murin, which is Emu from the Emu Nation, and my totem is a red kangaroo. And one of our songlines, or our main songline, is Emu, and it goes right up to Arakoon, right across to the Kimberleys, comes down at Adelaide. If you're from Adelaide, you know Moogie. Moogie's Emu. We connect up with Moogie. We didn't know that when we first danced together, mind you, on our country. It wasn't until a couple of years later that we sat down, we had a chance to sit down and actually have a yarn, and we realised that we're from that same songline. So very important. Dilim belim be, ma dilim belim bang, ana yang ngurumala, ma jibru, ana yang ngurumala. Ma dilim belim be, it's a bird with a big eye. Ma dilim belim bang, ana yang ngurumala, ma jibru, ana yang ngurumala. Aye. Thank you.